Hello everyone, and thank you for joining for this webinar. My name is Harlan Sandoniu, and I'm the Environmental Suppliers Officer at MCTC. And today we'll be focusing on single-use plastics and how we can phase them out of the supply chain and in general from our lives. Today's presentation will include a brief history about plastics, what is the current situation on the legislation and global movements when it comes to reducing plastics, and what we aim to do as MCTC, and what we expect from suppliers to do to combat this problem. I would like to mention that at the end of this presentation, a Q&A session will follow. And you can write your any questions you might have during the presentation in the chat room. The chat icon is located at the far up slide, toolbar slide, next to the people's icon. Just press that, and actually you can write any questions you might have there, and then I'll go through it at the end of the presentation and try to reply as accurately as possible. Now, I hope everyone hears me loud and clear. Okay. The history of plastics. Actually, the first plastic that was created, it was in the form of bakelite, and it was the first fully synthetic plastic that was ever created, which means it didn't contain any molecules that were found in nature. It was fully synthetic, that was made in the lab. It was a combination of phenol and formaldehyde. Phenol is actually a byproduct of coal tar. That's why we say plastics are petroleum-based. And it was actually produced to cover the needs of the rapidly expanding energy industry in the US. Actually, it was produced as an insulator for electric cables. The purpose was to prevent fires from shortages. It was very popular because it was very inexpensive, safe to use, very sanitary, and humans could shape it at any form they could imagine. During the 1900s, people, of course, were unaware of the ecological problems, and there was no actual recycling initiatives up to the late 70s. Bakelite actually is something interesting. Some interesting facts is that it turned out the outcome of the World War II and was considered one of the most innovative products ever created, because soldiers had the capability to have plastic items such as water canteens or gun protectors, helmet liners, even parachutes made out of plastic, and USA could rapidly produce them, and some people argue that it overturned the outcome of World War II. These are some of the common items that they were produced back at that time. In the middle, we can see a very familiar image of everyone. It's an old telephone, which I believe we all, at some point of our lives, we all came across this device, and a water canteen on the left-hand side, and so, some of them are even found today. After 100 years, you can still find them. They are still available. Moving on. This slide shows the plastic trend. On the right-hand side, we see the population growth, in billions. So now we are approximately a little bit more than 8 billion. And on the left-hand side, you can see the billions of tons produced each year. Right after World War II, we can see a linear production of single-use plastics, but then we see an exponential growth. It's worth mentioning that in just 60 years, the production has grown by 300 times, and about half of all plastic was produced in the last 15 years. Due to the market demands, population growth, there was a huge expansion in the plastic production industry. Something worth mentioning is, as you can see in this orange line, it shows where laws were introduced. So it shows where, in which year legislation was produced that actually had an effect, an impact on the single-use plastics problem. So we can see legislation was mainly introduced in the last 20 years. Before that, there was no control, no legal framework that was forbidding from companies from using or producing single-use plastics and without any special requirements. Now things have changed, so we're going to talk a little bit about it in the next slides. As I mentioned at the beginning, feel free to write any questions you may have in the chat, and I will address them after the presentation. Now, moving on, the plastic curves. In the image, you can see one of the developing countries of the world, and this is an image that we see very frequently because plastics find its way into our water systems in the river bodies and estuaries, and these systems usually found their way into the sea. And because of sea currents, usually they washed up on the beaches. And we get images like that. Even in high developed countries, this is very common to see. Even in Cyprus, in some remote beaches that they're not cleaned up very frequently, we do see images like that. Now, I want to focus a little bit more on single-use plastics, which quite differentiate from multi-use plastics. By definition, single-use plastic products are made wholly or partly of plastic and are typically intended to be used just once for a short period of time before they are thrown away. In comparison with multi-use plastics, single-use plastics have a very short lifespan, and they are not expected to be used for many times. And as we can see in the following slide, there are 6 major plastic polymers for single-use plastics, and around 70% of the global production is concentrated in these 6 major polymers. The most commonly produced item is water bottles, which are made of polyethylene, low-density polyethylene. And water bottles are made out of this plastic because it holds its integrity well when it holds water, and in its structure, it's sturdy enough to not to leak or have any issues when storing water. Now, the second most used is PVC, which is responsible for many household products such as plumbing pipes, clear food packaging, shrink wraps, many children's toys. And the next one is high-density polyethylene. This is mainly used for detergents because these 6 different resins have different properties, and each product is categorized according to its humidity, to its pH, to its erosion grade. So it needs to the container that holds a specific problem needs to be made by a specific resin. And on the next slide, we can actually see that the vast majority of plastic produced on a global level is single-use plastic. Around 75% of the polymers used is for single-use plastic. As I mentioned before, PVC is one of the polymers that is mainly used for many household items. Even you can find them in the automotive industry, in the construction industry. It has a variety of uses because of its capability to withstand loads and its longevity. However, PVC plastic is one of the most toxic polymers around, and we're going to see this in detail in further slides. So this is a slide that shows the lifespan of some of the most commonly used items. We see here that a single plastic bag takes 20 years to decompose, to totally dissolve in nature. This, especially for plastic straws, just imagine that a plastic straw can be used for 5 minutes. It stays in the environment for more than 200 years, almost more than 2 human life years, let's say. The next is plastic bottles, which stay for 450 years. And what I would like to emphasize is that these items are only used maybe less than 5 minutes, and they stay in the environment for hundreds of years. And this is where all the big issues rise up, because we create these items for our daily use. We use them for maybe a couple of minutes, and then we have to deal with them for the next, I don't know, 400 years. And this is part of why single-use plastics are a very important issue that we need to address. Now, why are plastics a problem? What actually is causing the problem is microplastics and nanoplastics. This is the real culprit, and this is what is creating issues to the environment and to the human health. As a definition, the US National Oceanic Administration and the European Chemicals Agency, they gave a definition of microplastic that are fragments of any plastic less than 5 millimeters. And usually it's a byproduct of larger pieces that break down. Nanoplastics are far smaller, at just 100 nanometers or less, and they are not visible to the naked eye. Most of the times we need microscopes to see them. The problem with these particles is that they can easily enter the water bodies, marine and terrestrial, and falsely mistaken by animals as prey, and they consume them. And this creates either chronic toxicity or acute toxicity, which we'll discuss a little bit in more detail in further slides. And there are also different ways of exposure for these particles. And the most alarming is that these particles are found in many products that they are destined for human consumption. One of the most common items that these particles are found in is sea salt, which contains 0.01 particles per gram. It might not sound much, but actually it is, and we're actually consuming it. Microplastics and nanoplastics are also found in water, beer, and fish. There were a few studies that emerged a few years ago that microplastics and nanoplastics were also found in breastfeeding milk and the placenta. So doctors were very alarmed that this bioaccumulation process takes place, and since then they greatly emphasized on the ways that we can combat this problem, because it has eventually found its way into the human body. Now, this image is what baffled scientists, and on the left-hand side we can actually see a species called Daphnia, and it's at the bottom of the food chain. It is what we call the keystone species. This is where all life starts from. These small animals, they are very, very small, most of the times not even visible to the naked eye, and they consume phytoplankton, and then these organisms are then consumed by other species, such as fish, some birds, especially flamingos. An interesting fact, they consume Daphnia, and it has a pigment. That's how they get their color from. Actually, Daphnia is pink because of hemoglobin, and flamingos get their color from this particular species. What scientists did, they embedded fluorescent dye into the digestive tract of these items in order to make microplastics visible through microscopic analysis. And what you can actually see here is the intestines of Daphnia, and all the fluorescent parts are microplastics that they have consumed as they thought it's prey. Here, the same. These are some stoneflies, mayflies, and all these fluorescent parts are microplastics. This is really, it really makes the scientific community baffled, because they realize that if microplastics are found in the lowest part of the food chain, then it bioaccumulates. Bioaccumulation is a term used when a certain chemical substance finds its way up the food chain. And we all know that the big fish is a small one, so that's how actually it moves up the food chain. If you are consuming contaminated fish, then all the contaminated particles move to the next predator. And the problem with these contaminants is that they are toxic, and as most of them are petroleum based, they contain toxins that create either short-term effects or long-term effects to either the organism or the final consumer. So this image better describes the problem, as this is actually the new food chain. It shows a fish that's consuming plastic and then ends up in our table. And we need to break this chain. We need to do something about it, because it's not only a matter of the environment anymore, it's also a matter of the human health. Now we're gonna discuss a little bit more detail about the environmental problems in this slide. It's a direct threat to biodiversity by entanglement or direct mortality. We've all seen in the news pictures of animals trapped in either fishing nets, plastic containers, and that causes direct mortality, which means it directly affects the individual and its death, or it causes indirect mortality by ingestion. So indirect mortality is either caused due to acute toxicity, which means the organism dies almost immediately due to the number of plastic particles that they consume, or acute chronic toxicity, which each individual is weakened and gradually it perishes. Many whales were found dead on beaches that contain almost a ton of plastic in their stomach because they confuse prey with plastic bags and they consume them. And it causes acute toxicity and they die. As I mentioned before, microplastics leach into the groundwater and surface water bodies. And as most of the water bodies are found their way into the sea, everything is transferred into the marine environment, where we also source our food from the marine environment. So lots of these particles are embedded within the natural predation environment of these species. Linked to the image I showed at the beginning, plastic pileups is a common sighting in many parts of the world, especially in remote islands where there's not much beach cleanups happening. We see that all the time. And another thing I would like to mention that these species, these microplastics have the capacity to destabilize the food chain. Due to acute or chronic toxicity, it affects keystone species and it decreases their population. So if there's not enough food around due to individuals dying from plastic consumption, then it goes up the food chain. Then we have, let's say, less production of fish, and then the populations start collapsing because the main requirement for a species to thrive is food capacity and room to grow. Room to grow is available because we are already overfishing the seas. So actually the main problem is that we are degrading their environment by leaching these particles into the sea. So now in recent years, aesthetic beauty of the natural environment has become a part of the environmental problem because aesthetic beauty of the natural environment is linked with depression. It showed that places with lower aesthetic beauty have higher rates of depression amongst humans. So because of that, scientists started to include this parameter as part of the environmental problems, and is now included in all the studies that are done. As I mentioned before, by accumulation up to the food chain, we discussed this earlier, and it's a real environmental problem because it moves up the food chain and eventually reaches our table. So now on this image, some of the image I was talking earlier, this is actually a careta, which they eat jellyfish. And as you can imagine, a plastic bag, it's very similar to jellyfish. And they confuse it and they consume it. A seagull entangled in a plastic mesh, same as a seal. This is a very common image in some of the breeding grounds of seals. And scientists try to counteract this by actually going there, captivating the animals and removing these nets. And direct mortality from ingestion of plastic to seabirds. Some species select bright colored objects to consume because they're used to seashells or microorganisms that are available on the coastal zone. They consume them, and because they cannot digest them or because of acute toxicity, they die. And these images can be found all around the world, and it's pretty alarming. And there are many NGOs that actually have actions of going to the beach and saving these animals. So now, single-use plastics and human health. We discussed about the problems in the environment. Now we're going to focus on the human health. Actually, small particles less than 150 micrometers can be absorbed by biota tissue, organs, and even cells. So when we are breathing air in high areas where, in high contamination areas where microplastics are carried out by the wind, we actually inhale them. And as the air exchange is happening in the lungs, because of the size of the particles, they can be absorbed through our lungs in our biota tissue and may pose acute saccharine toxicity, carcinogenicity, and developmental toxicity. In some countries of the world where plastics are a very, very big problem, we see developmental issues due to acute or toxicity, and the real threat directly to humans. And many in high areas, they discovered that cancer was caused by the either consumption or inhalation of microplastic or nanoplastics. As I mentioned before, PVC is classified one of the most toxic polymers, and because it is so abundant, when it breaks down, it's a real issue for human health. So the primary pathway of human exposure, as I mentioned before, is either by consumption, direct consumption through our food, mainly in seafood, because scientists of the research available, they discovered that microplastics and nanoplastics are found, 95% of them are found in marine products, like fish, shells, and even in kelps in some instances, through pulmonary inhalation and dermal infiltration. Now, dermal infiltration is by microbeads. A few years ago, cosmetic companies that were unaware of the impacts of these particles, they used to advertise that their product contained microbeads. These microbeads were made out of plastic, and they were not aware that they can be infiltrate the human skin. And now we see a shift from those practices. Nowadays, we don't actually the marketing turned around. Now they are advertising that their products do not contain microbeads, so they are safe for humans. So this is an example on how our perception changed with science-based approach, and how unaware we were of the problem, of this big problem. So, as I mentioned, microplastics may pollute drinking water, accumulate in the food chain, and release toxic chemicals that may cause diseases, including certain cancers. So, what are the global efforts to counteract the single-use plastic problem? Firstly, the leading union on this fight is the European Union. It's one body that took the most measures to combat this problem. So the most recent act is the Directive 2019-904, which sets a collection target of 19% of recycling on single-use plastic bottles by 2029, with an interim target of 77% by 2025. So in the European Union, they realized that, okay, the biggest problem and the vast majority of items that are single plastic is bottles. So for that reason, they decided to specifically target that product, and they set a target to reach during those years. I must say that things are not going very well. I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but recycling policies are mainly failing, and we're going to examine this in the further slides. Also, the union said that 25% of the bottles must be, the material must be 25% from recycled plastic, and 30% by 2030. So it's kind of introduces the circular economy into play. In addition, as part of the Green Deal, 55% of plastic packaging waste should be recycled by 2030. These targets have been set many years back, and from the examples that we see up to now, we are very far from reaching them, because some countries do not have the capacity to address the recycling rate. Something else that has come in recent years is ban on many single-use plastic items. Like in the European Union, first thing to go was a plastic bag, and then the following years, plastic cutlery was banned, and plastic straws. Now you cannot find them available in the market. So they are specifically targeting products that they have, that the scientists came up by the research that they did on beach cleanups. What they do is they go at the beach, they collect all the items, they go back to the lab, they classify each item, they see what are the most common items found in the environment. So based on that, they target their efforts on those specific items. In addition, in November in 2022, the Commission proposed a new EU-wide rule on the packaging. And now the packaging needs to have clear labeling to promote reuse, recycling, and call for a transition to bio-based, biodegradable, and compostable plastics. What that means is that now, on every product that we buy, we can easily identify from which resin it's made out of, to see if it's recyclable or not. And the consumer can make its based on the environmental sensitivity, let's say, of each one. Now, also the terms bio-based, biodegradable, and compostables come into the game, and we're going to start seeing them more and more into the markets now. Additionally, the EU is encouraging, is giving economic incentive to companies to use recycled products by reducing tax on certain resins that they are recycled and reused. And the far and most important thing the European Union did is that it stopped the shipments of plastic to OECD countries. OECD countries are countries that belong to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And one of the biggest players that was receiving this plastic was China. Let's say in the European Union, many countries that did not have the capacity to recycle plastic items, they were putting them on ships, sending them over, and there wasn't a way to check if those items were actually recycled or thrown in a landfill. And because of that, now it's a global problem. We're seeing a global approach to the problem. Scientists and the European Union, after science-based approach, they decided, okay, we stop this kind of practices. We need to deal the problem in our own grounds, because we have better control to see what actually is going on. Additionally, as I mentioned before, the European Union seeks to ensure that products claiming to be bio-based, biodegradable, or compostable meet minimum standards. So before setting the standards, one could say, okay, my product contains 20% bio-based resin, so it's bio-based. That doesn't imply anymore, it's not applicable anymore. There's a certain amount of bio-based resin that needs to be in the product, so it can be called bio-based. As I mentioned before, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat, and I will address them once the presentation is over. So now, continuing. Now we're going to see the global efforts for reducing plastics. Since March of 2022, the UN Environmental Assembly in Nairobi, they met and discussed what is said to be the most influential environmental policy since the Paris Accord. What this is saying that we should use science-based policy, and they said that they're gonna draft an agreement which will be legally binding for countries, and they will need to adopt these regulations or face legal consequences on a global scale. The important thing is that 175 countries stratified this agreement, which is quite a big number, and the treaty is aiming to have the agreement ready by 2024. Once this agreement comes into the game, everything will change, and then it will become legally binding on a global level that are going to take actions to combat the single-use plastics. Circular economy is something that is a model that many countries try to implement, and what it means is that we shouldn't be constructing products that have a short lifespan. We should be constructing products that they are sustainable and can withstand many years of use, so we don't throw them away very often, so we don't consume any natural resources, and they don't end up in the landfills and then creating more problems. As I mentioned before, the ban on plastic bags. In fact, 77 countries have placed a ban on plastic bags, and additionally, about 35 countries have placed tax. So when it's not for free anymore. If you either don't get the plastic bag or you have to pay for it. And ban on all single-use plastic items. India was one of the countries that actually has implemented a total ban, although there is no legislative infrastructure yet in the country, which means although the ban is implemented, there is no legal framework behind it, so it's not really applicable. But they are working on it, and at some point, the legal body will be there, and once a country is ready to implement this total ban, we're going to see more serious actions taken on this initiative. Something that is very applicable to us as we provide services to the maritime sector. The ship is strictly banned from discharging in any waters. This might sound very straightforward, but that was not the case about 20-25 years ago. And now the MARPOL Annex B is stating that even ashes from incineration should be landed, so they cannot discard anything. Ships are required to prepare even a garbage management plan, so they know exactly what they have on board and what kind of materials they have on board. And now we are starting to see that vessels are obliged to deposit plastic waste at reception facilities. Ashore, MARPOL requires port state signatories to provide adequate and appropriate reception facilities. So in many ports of the world, we are seeing that now So recycling is taking a structure, and some suppliers cannot even take the materials back for recycling. They need to be disposed properly and with the proper certificates and the proper evidence. So now Marco is saying the problem should be dealt at the port basis, and all the recycling material should be delivered at the reception facilities. The problem is that many IMO member states that do not have these reception facilities, and the legislation comes into conflict. But hopefully, in the upcoming years, it will resolve, and the recycling will start getting a proper structure, and everyone will be up to date of what actually we need to do to dispose these items properly. Now, is recycling the best possible solution? The straightforward answer is no. Recycling cannot cope with the rate that we are producing plastics, and it only mitigates for the wrongs of the past. And additionally, we don't have the capacity to recycle all the plastic that's being produced, either by actual recycling infrastructure, but we don't have them in place, or because of the cost. Recycling a product is energy consuming, cost consuming, and it creates a higher price for recycled material. So because there's no, up to now, there was no legislative framework, companies were not using it because of the cost, and they had no incentive to use it. Reuse, again, only delays the problem because each product, it reaches its lifetime and eventually will be discarded at some point or another. And again, it creates the same loop of a problem. And all the practices now are facing towards the phasing out of single-use plastics and looking for alternative resins, alternative products to deliver the products to the final consumer. All on a global effort, what is aimed is to educate people. Now we see in schools that they have recycling programs. They teach kids about the different resins, each product's recycling capabilities, and this is actually education is the key to making a change. Although it might skip some generations, eventually future generations will comply with these issues. How can we make the supply chain more sustainable? In the following slide, I will show some initiatives that we do in MCTC and what we expect from our suppliers. So now, we are really trying to shift towards sustainable packaging. We already did a market research to try to understand what is actually available and what cost. For that reason, we have sent a list to strategic places, strategic suppliers, where we want to find out what is available to the market and how much will it cost to shift towards sustainable packaging and not use plastic. Up to now, the market, I must say, it's not ready for it. But we want to take a top-down approach, and because if suppliers and end users starts calling for it, eventually the big producers will need to comply with these requirements. Eventually, it will be a requirement. Now it's only an option, but eventually, as the legislation is moving and the global efforts are going, eventually it will be a requirement and we need to be prepared for it. Our aim as MCTC is to phase out the single-use plastic on board. We know it's not an easy task. It will take some time, but that's what we are actually aiming to do in the depth of time. And I would like to mention that drastic changes call for drastic measures. It if you were asking about it 5 years ago, I would say, okay, no way possible. But now we see the European Union taking measures. There are global efforts to combat single-use plastic. So I believe change is far more near than it was 5 years ago. In addition, new emerging technologies will bring new sustainable packaging in the market. We see every day new resins. The EU is giving huge funds on finding new plant-based resins, which are actually fully biodegradable and can be used for delivering products on board. So as the time goes by, it will start getting into our lives. In addition, we discovered that the most important product that we need to target is plastic bottles, because we found out that just from water, we deliver about 300 kilograms of single-use plastic per vessel. So that's quite a big number, and that's why we are targeting this first. And what we came up with, that some possible solutions might be Tetra Pak. And we have already asked some suppliers to provide us with a quotation to see what are the import costs, what are the availability of such products in each country. And we are considering this also as an option. The next one is water filtration units, which it's the most environmentally friendly way to combat this problem and phase out plastic bottles. And again, overall, our aim is to phase out bottles and use sustainable packaging for water for the crew's daily needs. So in the following time, for sure you're gonna hear about from us regarding this initiative, and we'll do a wider market research to see what's available and what can be done. Now, we also want to target the actual byproducts of the supply chain. And one of that is pallet wrapping film, which up to now was mainly out of plastic. And I must say that most brands are not even recyclable. So even if you take them to a recycling facility, they will dispose them because they cannot reuse them. And up to 40 meters of film is used per pallet. So it's quite a big volume. As I mentioned before, most brands are non-recyclable and end up in landfills or incinerators. Incinerators is not a possible option because also it emits harmful byproducts into the atmosphere. An alternative to wrapping film, we discovered that they are available in the market some fully biodegradable films made out of cornstarch or any other plant resin. They are 100% recyclable, and they are mostly made out of biodegradable resins, and the cost is not so forbidding. We did, on the next slide, you can see that we did some testing, and overall, I have very satisfactory performance. We didn't get any bad feedback from vessels, and the results are very promising. Only downside is the cost, but as I mentioned, is not forbidding. And there are more and more brands coming into the game. I mean, every month we see something else emerging. So I believe in the following years, we're going to see more and more products available in the market, and there will be a vast majority of selection. So each supplier can order the appropriate film according to their needs. Actually, we do have some suppliers that adopted this practice in China, and they only offer biodegradable film. So it might sound like a small step, but it's really meaningful that we have already started doing this, and we removed this big plastic contaminant from the supply chain. This is just an example. You can see just this a type of wrapping film. The standard stretch film takes about 24 months to degrade small particles. Others take about 10 months. And this is fully biodegradable. This one is not. It's by the degrades in smaller particles. So we also want to target conventional pallets, although mostly they are not made out of plastic, but still causing a problem to the environment. Up to now, most of them are made out of wood or plastic. Don't see them in plastic. We don't see them very much in the industry because they're quite expensive. And the problem is that they are heavy and bulky, which increases transportation costs, and they have less fuel efficiency. I think each pallet is like 15, 20 kilos. Imagine having a truck full of them. They also contribute to deforestation. Now, in comparison, we discovered that there are some other alternative options in the market, such as sawdust pallets, which are sturdy enough to hold 2,000 kilograms. They are waterproof. And the big advantage is that they weigh only 4 kilograms per pallet, and they are stackable. So you can put, you can keep like 100 pallets in one stack, which is not possible with conventional wooden pallets. It increases fuel efficiency, and you can actually store more in a smaller area. In addition, we have cardboard pallets, which we have actually tested on board vessels. They are lightweight, cost efficient. They can withstand up to 1,000 kilos. The only downside is that they are susceptible to water damage. So they need to be, they need a little bit of treatment not to get wet, and they cannot be used multiple times. Now, the cost is something subjective because this kind of pallets, we found out that they are cheaper from wooden ones, but the price fluctuates, so it's not something, it's in the statement that can last through time, because we don't know how the market will behave. The tests we did have shown to be a promising alternative, but as I mentioned, we are still in the beginning. These products will start to become better, and we expect to see new products that are more sturdy. They can withstand water, and eventually we will start using them. Lastly, the method that we have seen in many countries, we have seen they have been using heavy-duty grain bags to deliver the products on board, especially in the anchorage area. These bags are cost-efficient, but not that expensive. They're easy to use. They are reusable, and some of them can withstand 3 tons of weight. Of course, you need to buy some equipment to be able to load and offload the bag. As you can see, there's a crane arm that needs to go with the bag. But it's a promising alternative, as environmentally friendly, and many suppliers have adopted it across the world. And the good thing is that we do not get any negative feedbacks about it. So it's working. So now, the future. We see global movements demanding for banning of single-use plastics, just recycling, and to start using more eco-friendly materials, not in the maritime sector, but not just that. Up to now, there is a race amongst the scientific community to invent alternative materials to plastic and raw wood. And eventually, in the following years, we're going to see a reformation of the food industry, the packaging industry, because everyone's alarmed. Now that they realize that we're consuming plastic, we need to do something about it. It might take some time, but eventually the supply chain will undergo to a reformation, as I mentioned, and it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So what we are doing, we're trying to share this information, disseminate this information, and at least give a heads up to our suppliers that these changes are coming and we need to adapt to meet the demands of the rapidly growing shipping industry and conform with all the legislation and the policies set either by the European Union or other member states. conclude, this is a very powerful statement. It's only one straw said 8 billion people. We always need to remember that the population has rapidly expanded, and even the smallest action by a person can make a huge difference. For that reason, every one of us needs to be environmentally sensitive and shift our actions and needs and anything that has to do with our daily life towards more environmentally friendly practices to keep the future for future keep the environment for future generations the way it should be. And this is somehow the definition of sustainable development, which is we need to preserve the environment for future generations to have the same access to clean water, clean air, and forests and any other natural environment, so our kids can also have this privilege to live in a very clean world, sustainably, and be able to grow without having to combat illnesses because of our actions as humans. That's all from my side. That's all what I have to mention. Feel free to write any questions you may have in the chat room. I'll be very happy to answer them. Even if you have any questions that you may you want an answer, you can always email me. Most of you have our email address. Our lines of communication are always open, and I'll be more than happy to discuss and answer any question you may have on this topic. I'm going to leave the webinar open for a few minutes in case anyone wants to ask any questions, and then I'm going to end the seminar. Thank you for joining. Thank you for attending, and hopefully we're going to see a change in the following years. Thank you very much. Hello, Ali. Thank you very much for your comment. Very well indeed. It's a very informative webinar, and it's something that we all should know and we should be alarmed, so we can actually reform our actions and how we can actually prevent this kind of incident. And we do know USA is having some issues on these initiatives. However, it's not people do face these kind of problems, and eventually the word will spread also in the US, and eventually a change needs to happen. But yes, someone has to step up. Gustavo, yes, we do know that the water in a box is more expensive. That's why we are examining the possibilities and what's available in the market. Owners have starting to rethinking their approach, and as there is, as I mentioned, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. When it will become legislation, everyone will have to comply. So the price difference, I know it's a big factor, but the environmental well-being and human well-being is far more important than actually just the price. So what we are doing is that we are collecting all this information, and we're going to go back to the owners and share this with them, and then we will initiate the discussion to see how it will go. But until we have the data available, it's not something I can definitely give a definite answer. By him, that's why we are preparing the maritime industry for this. That's why we are doing the market research. We are collecting all this information, and later in the year, we're gonna have meetings to present this data and see how we can actually make a change. As I mentioned, is not the price is subjective, because, as you know, the cost of recycling is also increasing. So everything needs to balance out, and we'll see what is environmentally friendly first, cost efficient, and we're gonna assess every option. So as I said, I don't have a definite answer at the moment, but if it becomes a matter of legislation, everyone will need to comply regardless of the price. Hello, Daniel. Thank you for your question. Everything you will all get informed once we have more information. We'll keep you updated, and nothing will be done prior to confirming that everything is available in each country. Everything will clearly stated once we go ahead with this initiative. So, Thomas, thank you for your question. Yes, I know that the price is a big factor, and some companies are hesitant to go with this option. But from experience, we have companies that, okay, they said we want to ban single-use plastics, but we would like to know the cost. And at this time, we are at this stage. We're trying to understand what are the costs involved, compare, let's say, the cost of disposing single-use plastic and delivering the vessels with alternative packaging. And once we have a definite answer, we know in advance the pricing. So we hope that the effort to ban single-use plastic will overcome the price. So, and as I mentioned before, I know at this time Tetra Pak, water in Tetra Pak is quite expensive. The thing is, there's no competition at the moment because not many companies are producing. And for that reason, the prices are high. Once more bigger players start to come into the game, we'll see a decrease for sure. It's always like that. The market works like that. Fahim, I don't understand your question. And does the information about comply? We know it's quite expensive, but as I see, this screenshot is from Amazon. The market, I believe, is not reflecting, is not volume based. So I cannot definitely say that this is the real price. Let's say it's different buying one case, it's different buying 100 cases. But yeah, we know that the price is higher, but that's why we are collecting information and trying to understand what's available in the market. In some countries, water in a box is way cheaper than the price in the picture, and that is because many producers and importers are actually starting to import this water in that specific container. Hello, Javier. Thank you for your comment. I know that 20-liter bottles might seem, and replacing these bottles might seem a more eco-friendly way of supplying the vessels with the drinkable water. However, based on our experience, we do face some issues that these bottles are need to be returned at the source where they bought them from. And usually we have a vessel that's going to a specific port and is not going again to that specific port, then we have an issue. And the thing is, not all the vessels have water dispensers on board because they just don't use them, and for that reason, it's not a definite solution for this problem. But as I mentioned in the presentation, we are looking to examine new other methods, such as filter water dispensers that will eliminate the use of any kind of plastic water or water in a Tetra Pak. We are doing this market research, and we're exploring possible options. So we can go back to the to our clients and let them know the available options and the choice they want to go through with. Okay, thank you all for attending. If you have any further question, please feel free to reach out either through mail or even if you can always call me. Thank you for attending and wish you a nice day ahead. Bye-bye.